Well, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'm Jamal Hudson, Chairman of the Virginia State Corporation Commission. And before we start today's webinar, I'm going to give maybe a couple of minutes for everyone to kind of jump into the room, and then we'll begin. So thank you very much. All right, so let's begin. I'm Judge Jamal Hudson from the Virginia State Corporation Commission, and I'm the former chair of the Select Committee on Regulatory Industry and Diversity. Before I begin, I just want to take this opportunity to congratulate Commissioner Maida Coleman from the Missouri Public Service Commission for being appointed the new chair of this committee. I'm truly honored that Commissioner Coleman will continue to look forward to helping lift the important mission of the Select Committee on Regulatory and Industry Diversity's strategic collaborations, webinars, and finding new ways to engage with the regulatory community and resources for our members. So today we have a really great webinar for you today. The webinar is entitled, How the Regulatory Process Can Advance Equity. There are many state regulators that are considering environmental justice, impacts on disadvantaged and historically underrepresented communities, diversity and inclusion, as well as looking at new and different ways of engaging procedures to address the many energy burdens that we're feeling today. So today we'll hear from Commission staff and subject matter experts on how to provide options that regulators can consider when they're addressing equity. So what I'd like to do right now is turn it over to Raphael Bright from the Regulatory Assistance Project to moderate today's program.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Hudson. And I just want to start off by saying today's webinar is the first in a series of webinars that RAP is putting together with NARUC. The next two webinars will focus on workforce diversity and long-term affordability. So keep an eye out for those coming in April and May. I do also want to kind of briefly point out that if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box down in the center, a little bit on the left-hand side of your Zoom screen. We will have time at the end of our presentations for some Q&A. So if you have questions, type them out at any point and indicate to whom you are asking a question, and we will get to as many as we are able before the end of the hour. And with that, I want to get started. Our first panelist is Eric Sippert, who is a U.S. Department of Clean Energy innovator at the Hawaii PUC. His work focuses on energy equity in Hawaii's transition to 100% renewable energy, including public engagement, resource procurement, grid planning, and bill assistance programs. Take it away, Eric.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Raphael. And I would like to thank all of the organizers for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's a real honor to be on this panel, and I'd like to thank my fellow panelists as well. So today I'm going to be talking about public engagement, equity, and public utility commissions. As Raphael noted, I'm a Department of Energy Clean Energy innovator at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, which essentially means that I get to do independent research as well as work for the commission. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk very briefly about our ongoing energy equity and justice docket before talking about a research report I published on public engagement at public utility commissions, specifically looking at Hawaii, but I think with many lessons for other public utility commissions as well. And that also means that my views represent neither the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission nor the U.S. Department of Energy. They are all my own. Next slide, please. So just to describe very briefly this energy, equity, and justice docket we've opened at the Hawaii PUC. So we have many different dockets and proceedings that deal with equity in some way, but this docket addresses equity specifically, so I just wanted to mention it briefly. We opened this docket in late 2022 in response to a Hawaii State legislative resolution calling for the Public Utility Commission to investigate equity in its work. So this is an investigative docket, and we've developed 5 different work tracks that we're looking at. Procedural equity, which is really what my report is speaking to, talking about public engagement and really thinking about who is participating at the commission in what ways, who's at the table, who isn't at the table, and how do we change that to be more equitable. We're also looking at energy affordability and direct payment assistance, equitable siting and hosting of energy infrastructure, equitable access to clean energy, and utility performance and tracking. And I also highly recommend you check out our website on the docket. And just to give you an idea of where we're at on the docket, we recently completed a series of meetings on equity considerations in renewable resource procurement. Our largest utility in Hawaii has another round of resource procurement coming up. And we had a series of community meetings trying to figure out how to increase equity considerations in that upcoming resource procurement process. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to get into my report, Public Engagement and the Public Utilities Commission Paths to 100% Renewable Energy in Hawaii. And the really big question motivating this report is, what is and what should be the role of the Hawaii PUC regarding public engagement in the transition to a 100% renewable portfolio standard? And the problem here is that, as in many other states, Hawaii's 2045 renewable portfolio standard requires this massive build out of renewable energy infrastructure and projects. And in Hawaii, we have the context of high energy prices, very severe land constraints, 6 disparate island grids, and a public that's generally wary of development. And kind of the wager behind all of this research is that the technical and financial aspects of the clean energy transition are often studied and somewhat understood, but I would argue that we really need to understand the social side of this renewable energy transition. And we can think about that as equity. And I think just to reiterate, kind of the big question underlying all of these discussions of equity, in my mind at least, is will the renewable energy transition combat existing inequality, or will it simply exacerbate it and make it worse? Next slide, please. So to look at these questions, I did a total of 31 interviews talking to Hawaii state government officials, PUCs, and FERC actually, across the country, former commissioners, interveners in community-based organizations, utilities and developers, and subject matter experts. So folks at places like national labs, consultants that work with PUCs frequently. And I would describe this research as not even identifying best practices yet. I think we're still really early in figuring out public engagement and procedural equity. So I would rather talk about identifying emerging practices and getting a really preliminary idea of like what's working and what isn't. Next slide, please. And I'll actually skip this slide for the sake of time. Next slide. So another kind of broad purpose of this research is trying to really break down what PUCs are doing so far in terms of public engagement, and trying to like differentiate and categorize this big bucket of public engagement into separate smaller buckets. And the idea here is that we can then think more critically about what's working, what isn't, and make more informed decisions about what we as public utility commissions actually want to focus our efforts on in terms of public engagement. So when I was completing these interviews, I started really high level and I asked people what they think the role of the PUC should be in terms of public engagement. PUCs are in a very unique position We're quasi-judicial institutions focused on regulation, not a real strong history of engaging with the public. But when I asked people this question, I got three main categories of answers. So the first was focused on education and empowerment. And the idea here is that the renewable energy transition is changing many things. People have a much different relation to energy now than they do in the past. They have the potential to be producers of energy. It's just a very different relationship. And that one thing that commissions can do is really educate the average consumer in many different ways. And people may trust a state government entity more than their utility or a developer. So PUC should focus on education and empowering consumers. The second bucket was facilitation and cooperation. And these answers really focused on the PUC's unique role as a quasi-judicial institution and their ability to bring different groups together. So here, think of a PUC can bring together a utility, a developer, and an environmental organization, get all these groups in the same room, talking to each other, and kind of actually force them to talk to one another rather than simply talking past one another. And then finally, the third bucket that I heard from interviewees was that the PUC should actually work as a representative for communities. And this is, I would say, the most controversial because it gets pretty close to advocacy. But these answers really focused on the difficulty of community groups intervening at PUCs and said PUC should actually go out, figure out what these communities want and need, and regulate considering that input. Next slide, please. So if that's very high level thinking about roles, a step down is actually thinking about different types of actions in terms of engagement that PUCs can take. And I developed this typology dividing actions into 4 different categories that PUCs can take. And this was drawing on many different examples across the US, and these are further detailed in the report. But the first is outreach. So really sharing what the commission does with the public, including how to get involved. This is really that education role. And examples here are things as simple as making websites easier to understand, more for a layperson rather than an expert, to much more formal things like creating an Office of Public Engagement, like Texas has done or FERC has done. Second is solicitation. So this is the opposite of outreach. This is really trying to solicit or get input or engagement from non-traditional stakeholders. And the traditional thing here would be intervener compensation, but there's also broader participant funding and things like oversight and advisory boards. The third is oversight. So PUCs have a unique ability to require utilities and sometimes the developers to engage with the public and oversee it. And then fourth is alternative models. And this is really a catch-all for things that don't really fit into the first 3 categories. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if people would like. Next slide, please. Okay, so to finish things off, my report ends with 7 recommendations. And again, these are my own personal views, but I think that these recommendations are applicable to many PUCs. So first, I do really think that PUC should create offices of public engagement, external affairs, or something similar and staff adequately. I think that public engagement really requires a special skill set that PUCs may not have. Second, heavily increase education and outreach. I think this is really low-hanging fruit and relatively easy to do. Third, create advisory councils or boards instead of intervener compensation. And I can talk later more about why I think that's more useful than intervener compensation. And I'll skip down for the sake of time. And that 6, I think, so grid planning processes are really important. They're determining what the grid's going to look like 10, 15 years in the future. And the more we can get the public involved now, the better. And then finally, number 7, the more we're doing this public engagement, I think we need to make sure that we're archiving it and it's cumulative and not just like screenshots of what people think over time. So really thinking about how we archive and keep that data and use it over and over rather than simply doing the same thing over and over again. Thank you very much, everyone, and I will pass it back to Raphael.
Thank you so much, Eric. For our second panelist, we're going to bring in Jesse Chula, who's a commission advisor from the Colorado PUC. Jesse works on issues related to gas utility planning and incorporating procedural and distributional equity into the agency's proceedings and processes. Before that, she was at RMI, where she facilitated diverse stakeholders confronting challenging energy issues and also researched utility business models and regulatory strategies to advance the clean energy transition. So go ahead, Jesse.
Thanks so much, Raphael. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jesse Shula, and I'm an advisor with the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. Thank you to RAP and NERUC for organizing and hosting and inviting me to participate in this event. And thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm excited to learn a lot with you all this hour. I'm really excited today to talk about the Colorado Public Utility Commission's recent work to advance equity through our processes. And just to note, we are very much still in the exploration stage. I think similar to what Eric said, we're at emerging practices before best practices. So we're still in the phase where we're taking input from the public, taking a look at our own internal processes, and trying to make improvements. But we are really learning right now and kind of piloting what our actions will be moving forward. We can go to the next slide. So today, I think it'll be important to first set a bit of some ground consensus around the environment for action, sort of what the impetus is for change within our commission. Second, I will go over the commission's existing equity initiatives proceeding. I'll talk about our equity framework that the agency is working on, and finally conclude with some lessons that we're learning along the way. You can go to the next slide. So there are three major actions that have sort of occurred in the last year or so, or 2 years, that have really implicated a need for change within the state. The first was that in 2021, Senate Bill 21-272 was passed, which mandated that the commission promulgate rules requiring that we consider equity in all of our work, including how we review filings, and also consider how to best provide equity, minimize impacts, and prioritize benefits to disproportionately impacted communities and address historical inequities. What this meant for us is that it can't just be creating these rules changes in a vacuum, but we recognize that we need an enabling set of processes to ensure that the commission, utilities, and other stakeholders have the tools and processes in place to use these rules changes to actually consider equity, right? We can't just change rules and expect process to follow. We need to be really deliberate about how we create an environment that enables these rules to really work towards advancing equity. Second, like many states across the country, we're seeing some major rate increases, volatile fuel commodity prices, and just generally an environment that is putting stressors on our income qualified customers and communities. Last winter specifically, we, along with some other state agencies, received executive direction to develop short and long-term solutions to energy burden in the state. And so that was another impetus for change. We really need to look at what's happening here and figure out what changes can be made. And then third, we have in the state a commitment to address transition to a decarbonized future. And what that really means is that the transition has enormous potential to combat inequities that exist, but that's not a guarantee, right? We need a really concerted effort across all stakeholders to bring in voices that aren't traditionally involved in our processes, as well as to really work on making the transition something that does not exacerbate existing inequities. So all of these factors together implicate changes to our processes. We want to take action to assess and improve what we're doing to make sure that these outcomes will really be able to advance equity in the state. And so we have taken action to assess and improve our processes along two pathways. First, the proceeding I'll talk about next, and then later our equity framework. So we can go to the next slide. So in April of 2022, about a year ago, we opened a miscellaneous docket, which is sort of an investigatory docket in other states, to look at how we might implement Senate Bill 21-272, which, as a reminder, is asking us to consider equity in all of our work. So upon opening that proceeding, we set a number of objectives and laid out a number of workshops to broadly get stakeholder input through workshops and comments on how we should be scoping this, right? This is a really major change for us. And so the first thought was, let's go out and get an understanding of what stakeholders think is the biggest priority. That occurred through about middle of this year, when we had a decision issued to delegate the authority in the proceeding to staff, which led to a staff work plan and a set of activities that we will be conducting through this summer to result in a capstone report that will address all of the information we've gathered and eventually move us into a rulemaking or set of rulemakings to help us consider equity in all of our work. And so the proceeding, similar to Hawaii, I guess, has 5 work tracks. They're a little bit different, but the 5 that we took on are first tiering cases. We see an immense amount of cases and proceedings come in every year, somewhere in the 700 range. And so considering equity in all of those proceedings is going to look different. What interventions are needed is going to look different depending on the proceeding type. And so what we really want to do is take a close look at what the scope of the proceeding is and who it might be affecting to determine where we need to apply additional outreach and or data analysis requirements, or where our processes as they currently stand are adequate. And so we've been working with stakeholders to gather information on that. Second, we have been looking at meaningful outreach and engagement. We really recognize that regulatory proceedings are mysterious, and we don't want that to be the case moving forward. So we're trying to figure out what interventions we can take both to do more proactive outreach to stakeholders and also make it easier to solicit input from different stakeholders. So we're looking at a number of different interventions there. Third, the legislation requires us to minimize impacts and maximize benefits and ensure proportionate access to certain communities in our states. So we're taking a first look at what are those impacts, what are those priority benefits, and then how can we actually measure and ensure proportionate access. We don't want this to be a check the box activity that funding went to a certain outcome. We really want to make sure that we know that the actions we're taking are yielding results. Third, our state has passed a unified definition of what a disproportionately impacted community is. I won't go into that now, but essentially we want to make sure that we're comfortable with that. We're sort of making sure that the tool, it is a diagnostic tool, but it is not something that is restrictive in any way, but making sure that we have data to assess what this means for us, what this means for our programs, and really make sure that those communities are being are the focus and scope of this proceeding. And then finally, sort of a catch-all track is synthesizing our rules changes as we've been going through all these different activities. We're sort of on the back end looking at what does this mean for our rules. And so we'll want to interface with our stakeholders before we move into a rulemaking, just to make sure that the pulse that we've been gathering is the pulse that they think is happening. We can go to the next slide. So internally, we've also been working on an equity framework. We received recommendations early in our equity proceeding that considering equity in all of our work is a really large task, and it could be helpful for us to put together a framework to help us focus our efforts and prioritize internally how we are working on this. And so we're really lucky to have the assistance of Justin Schote at the Energy Equity Project to the University of Michigan to help us draft and scope this framework over the past year. The framework includes 4 dimensions of equity around which we are guiding certain actions that the agency is taking and considering internally. It includes a set of guiding principles, which we held workshops on with various members of the public this past summer to really steer our actions, priorities, and directions. This is sort of a North Star for us as we're thinking about how to prioritize. Third, we will provide an overview of each industry or team within the PUC. Sort of serves two reasons. First, to demystify, we have all these different teams. What exactly are they doing? What do we regulate? And then second, to sort of uncover some equity concerns that our teams are seeing that we might be able to work on. Fourth, we lay out a set of goals and metrics based on some internal priorities that we could use to advance equity within our agency. And then finally, we'll culminate in a strategic work plan and reporting requirements to hold ourselves accountable and also recognize that this is a lot of work and it's going to have to be done in phases. So we can go to the next slide. In the interest of time, I'll be quick here, but I just wanted to highlight some of the actions that we're already taking to improve equity in our processes. And again, right now we're at the phase where we're trying. We're not totally sure we've improved, but we need to try new things to yield improvements. We've created an equity webpage that shows sort of the history of equity initiatives within the commission, as well as events that the public can get involved in. We've held about 5 workshops and some more comment opportunities on these various work tracks to make sure that we are soliciting input from diverse stakeholders. We formed our first equity advisory focus group. And we're really thrilled to have about 15 focus group participants from across the state who are providing us some real-time recommendations and feedback on different things we're developing. For example, last month we thought we had this great PUC 101, and they were all like, this is really hard to understand, like take that back. So, we're getting some good input from them. We've had a number of commissioner information meetings, one that Michelle and Eric actually presented on earlier this month to help us understand sort of what we can take and learn from other states. And then we're doing some broader strategic planning and communication efforts to make ourselves a little bit more transparent. You can go to the next slide. Lessons we're learning. I know I'm at it over time, so I'm just going to leave these for us to think about. Community outreach, how do we incorporate it? Who should conduct it? It's really hard. We're a staff of 100 in a state of millions. So what is our role and what are the partners that can help us really do this well? Participant fatigue. We're running dozens of workshops and we're asking people to volunteer their time. How can we make sure that those are well worth people's time and actually address the issues people care about? Decision-making transparency. We can't make decisions that solve every single person's needs at any given time. So how do we talk about how we're quantifying trade-offs, how things are interconnected, and how we're broadly trying to move forward in incorporating different voices? Actions yield change and data analysis is kind of one of the more tough ones. We've got a bit of a chicken and egg thing going on here where can't really have better outcomes without better processes, but processes alone don't yield better outcomes. So how do we balance making good processes and setting ourselves up for successful outcomes? And sort of, we don't want people to feel like they're just participating in a process that doesn't yield change. So we're figuring out what that balance looks like. So with that, thank you. I'll turn it back to Raphael.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Next up, we have Michelle Scala, an Energy Justice Program Manager at the Oregon PUC. Michelle champions social equity and environmental justice throughout regulatory proceedings, including integrated resource plans, clean energy plans, general rate cases, and policy implementations. Take it away, Michelle.
Thanks, Rafi. My name is Michelle Scala. I'm from the Oregon Public Utility Commission. And as Raphael indicated, I have the unique privilege of getting to work in both kind of broad agency efforts in advancing energy justice, as well as kind of docket-specific implementation efforts. And it's been a really exciting ride. So I'm excited also to hear that more of the country is interested in pursuing these kinds of actions. So I can go to the next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I'm actually going to go into more detail on these 4 specific elements in the following slides, but just to kind of highlight the topical considerations to be discussed, I'd like to highlight Oregon's equity work in terms of how structural support plays a role, implementing equity in utility planning and investment strategies, procedural justice, which I think the previous panelists did a great job speaking on, and our focus on affordability. So with that, I can go to Next slide. So here for structural support, I just think that in the interest of taking the most, I guess, meaningful step forwards in advancing equity, some of the things that Oregon has found to be very, I guess, helpful have been things like having laws, rules, and orders in place to make equity more intentional across different types of stakeholders. It can sometimes facilitate dialogue that we as a group know needs to take place and avoid some unnecessary back and forth that can often exacerbate participant fatigue or sometimes create less than optimal solutions in an effort to compromise where sometimes we already know the best practices have been identified. Secondly, I think that this was referenced in some of the Q&A chat, but dedicated funding and mandatory actions to ensure resources and compel actions towards energy justice can be very valuable as well. So dedicated funding can take many forms, but some of what we've seen is authorization for recovery that streamlines the utility's willingness to engage in certain types of programs, such as energy affordability measures, and intervener funding, which allows space for environmental justice and consumer advocacy interveners to come into our regulatory process and provide perspectives and storytelling that we haven't seen in the past. Next, adopting equity language and commitments in our mission statements. This is something that I think is paramount to having a cultural change in the agency. You know, we're ripe with professional technical expertise, and there's a lot of history in the way that utility regulation has been done. And so kind of taking that transformative language into your agency objectives can help to facilitate adoption amongst staff and then therefore your recommendations and your decision-making. Inclusive language for environmental justice and equity goals. This helps to avoid some of the pitfalls that I think some of the previous panelists have identified as far as like understanding who is meant to be included in these kind of like equity objectives. And so what Oregon has found is rather than being hyper specific about it's just X, Y, and Z populations, we've kind of created an including but not limited to language where we identify known communities to experience disproportionate energy burdens and impacts of the energy system, but also recognizing that there may be other groups that haven't been explicitly identified in statute that share some of the same characteristics and from an objectives-based standpoint should be included for any additional protections or eligibility or specific targeted engagement that we're trying to do. Updating administrative rules is another kind of low effort, high impact action. And I mean, I use the word low effort judiciously because I know that process does require a lot and for some commissions more than others. But you'll find, I think, in reviewing some of the existing like administrative rules governing the agency, that there are features of customer protections and equity considerations built in. They just might be a little bit dated. And those present opportunities to not only create dialogue around how to enhance these protections, but also, you know, what was the mindset that made them insufficient in today's equity climate and why, and what learnings can we take from modifying these to leverage other processes. Because again, that's a way to minimize participant fatigue and create dialogue that will influence decisions across different dockets and spaces. And then lastly, investing in dedicated equity staff. That's like myself, and we recently were able to hire an energy justice analyst to support this work. And we have an excellent diversity, equity, and inclusion director at our agency, all of which again, leverage the kind of commitment of the agency to pursue these goals and provide useful resources when it comes to getting into specific dockets, but also advancing a cultural change. And something that I had heard specifically from our director is when you're considering the application of dedicated resources and positions, part of that consideration should include how quickly you think your agency is wanting to and willing to move forward with advancing equity, because sometimes, especially in larger states or more complex utility regulation climates, you might not be, you know, equipped with a power of few, and you may need more in terms of a power of many. So I'll go to the next slide here. So this is utility planning and investment strategies in terms of our work with equity. I believe this slide captures more of the framework or broadly applied equity foci that staff is currently engaged in across multiple dockets. And our role here as a commission staff is to promote, support, and supplement these objectives through utility actions. So in recalling Eric's earlier presentation segment on the commission versus the utility role in leveraging resources, the Oregon PUC has endeavored to take a similar approach to what I believe I heard Eric say, where we work kind of as a representative community, sometimes in the realm of advocacy, while setting expectations regarding energy justice and equity outcomes in relation to utility actions and plans. This includes in the integrated resource plans, clean energy plans, transportation electrification plans, general rate cases, and all of the above. So it helps us to set the groundwork and allow for a space that advances procedural, distributional, and recognition justice. And this comes down to starting things off with the right people at the meaningful table. You need to look beyond the traditional technical expertise and stakeholders and consider the practical impacts of proposals so you can collaborate with stakeholders on what their priorities and perspectives are, like I think Jessie highlighted in her presentation. So again, this is an opportunity for recognition justice because you understand any historical context and intersectional impacts of community identities and where they live across the energy system. I also think it's important that the Oregon Public Utility Commission has endeavored not to allow this engagement to be extractive, and we are trying to advance the narrative that community input is a service to our process. So being transparent and accountable to the feedback helps to promote not only repeated engagement, but trust between stakeholders, utilities, and staff. Part of this requires us to ask the right questions at the right time so that feedback can be meaningful and not inadvertently disregarded due to lack of applicability. This requires us to coalesce on expectations early and often. So in, for example, our Clean Energy Plan implementation docket UM 2225, we had a very iterative and inclusive process that allowed for straw proposals, scoping, comments over the course of several months that ultimately led to at least an initial framework from which the utilities could craft their clean energy plans, which we could say was informed by kind of thresholds between the commission and the community. And then at the end of the day, I think measures of effectiveness, including feedback loops, is essential here. And that goes in line with the major themes of accessibility, transparency, and accountability. Now go to the next slide, please. And this is where I'm going to go lighter because, as I said, I think procedural justice has been well covered by the previous panelists. I'll just briefly highlight specific actions that Oregon has found to be well received and successful as first steps, both in terms of adopting best practices, but also learning where opportunities exist to improve. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have intervenor funding in place. This was advanced through House Bill 2475, which went into law in January of 2022. This $500,000 is offered annually, and in extending it, we had our chief administrative law judge work with communities and advocates to have a more informed and accessible application process. This included allowing intervenor funding awards to be issued on a topical basis, so just broadly for energy affordability dockets, rather than requiring parties to identify specific dockets that they wanted to engage in. And we also extended multiple training opportunities and continue to do so, from which folks can engage with intervenor funding application. We've also implemented a lot of novel processes to explore ways to be a little bit different in terms of our procedures that will encourage more and frequent community engagement. Educational opportunities we've highlighted to be bi-directional, so it's not just about the presenters talking at a group, but also taking the feedback in and being able to provide practical feedback in real time. This again encourages people to come back to the table rather than being concerned that they're just spending resources and time to not be able to contribute. And then lastly, advisory groups. For me, this is an opportunity area because I think that when you're going into advisory groups, there's a ton of value and it does provide a platform for representative voices. At the same time, ahead of the game, you want to make sure that there are accountability and transparency features built in. So depending on the facilitating entity, there is that room for feedback loops. Next slide, please. So this is where I think Oregon maybe has the most to offer in this specific space relative to the fact that I'm speaking, and that's our focus on affordability. It's difficult for equity actions to receive the requisite and meaningful engagement in consumer climates that are wrought with energy burden, energy insecurity, and energy poverty. So for example, staff has heard in a number of forums from utilities that community engagement is largely relegated to concerns around affordability. And discussions on clean energy transitions, resiliency actions, and more can be overshadowed by looming rate pressures. So in conjunction with the legislation of the Energy Affordability Act, the Commission has largely elevated a focus on affordability as among the highest priorities in our planning and rate dockets. Here we have both the authority and process to address the issue, and some of the actions that we've taken are to call for energy burden assessments, otherwise known as low-income needs assessments, from our utilities. They're currently not mandated, but we have issued, pretty firm guidance, and we find that the results have been very helpful. I think Washington has some examples of energy burden assessments, as does California, and maybe some of the others on the call. But they provide more granular customer segmented data that allow for those distributional justice components to be considered in planning and rate making. We've also done a lot with customer protections, expanding our Division 21 disconnection protections to offer chances for reconnection charges to be waived, for disconnection to be kind of mollified for certain communities under certain conditions. And again, that low-hanging fruit I talked about earlier. We've also begun exploring more targeted demand-side management and have seen many utilities come forward with new designs to their programs in an effort to increase participation rates. For what's next, I think we can just go straight to the next slide, because I think this is where we're talking about our multi-phased approach. So when we were implementing the HB 2475 Energy Affordability Act, we wanted to balance near-term relief with a comprehensive investigation. And so what we already have in our rearview mirror are interim programs that achieved easy wins by adopting percentage of bill discounts that could be applied with low barrier features that I'll discuss more about later. And they were palatable for the utility. So they kind of allowed for streamlined engagement in non-contested case processes. We, as staff, facilitated multi-stakeholder and utility engagement that allowed us to kind of establish baseline criteria ahead of utility proposals and voice or elevate concerns from community well before we actually had the Commission review the dockets. This evaluation criteria also allowed us a kind of streamlined way to review, present, and recommend on the utility proposals. So right now we're in the phase of a comprehensive investigation, some of the work of which Rafi has been so gracious to help us with through RAP. But basically we're trying to do priority-based rescoping. We've issued a equity landscape analysis questionnaire to our stakeholders, and we're trying to do something similar to what Jessie identified in her presentation, where we prioritize components of the implementation based on community needs and interests. This includes cross-issue workshopping so that we can leverage federal dollars and state programs that don't directly fall under HB 2475 to advance participation rates in our energy burden mitigation toolkit. We're also looking at data needs and performing a landscape analysis about what we currently have and how we can leverage those resources in addition to others in order to create kind of a more holistic framework for program evaluation relative to energy justice. And then what's next is we're hoping that we can implement some identified standards through this process. It might include data requirements or a rulemaking as far as energy burden thresholds, if those actually come to play. And then the adoption of additional features to differential rate designs and potentially customer classifications. Next slide. So I think I'm almost over here, so I'll just kind of leave this for folks to look at later, but these are the baseline evaluation criteria that we identified in that near-term engagement. And they just include several components that we have found and vetted with community as being effective ways to improve programs from, say, traditional energy assistance like LIHEAP, including self-attestation of income. I know that's not always a comfort zone for folks, but it has really profoundly improved our participation rates, even though, looking at the data afterwards, several of them were already LIHEAP customers that enrolled ahead of auto enrollment application. We're very intentional about the level of relief and have asked for programs to provide tiered income-based qualifications and discount levels to ensure that the most benefit goes to the most burdened. We've been very intentional as well about tracking and accounting and are hoping to make more groundwork on that in the comprehensive investigation process, as well as bundling with energy efficiency components, recognizing that demand-side management is where long-term sustainable energy burden mitigation strategy really exists. And then outreach and engagement to make sure that programs on an ongoing and frequent basis are vetted with community. Next slide, please. Similarly, this is something that I can just have folks look at later, but it's just some of the feedback that we've received from fellow staff and stakeholders on best practices to consider when trying to advance equity in our community engagement strategies. And I'll just end it there.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Our final panelist today is Quinn Parker, the CEO at NColor. Quinn is a trainer, facilitator, and certified diversity professional with over 16 years of experience in regulatory finance, utility analytics, program research, design, planning, implementation, and strategic planning. She's delivered web-based and in-person workshops, talks, and trainings for organizations across the country, including NARUC, NREL, NASIO, ACEEE, and others. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Quinn. Take us home.
Yes, thank you. And a lot of the information I will share with you by the previous panelists are kind of build on what I want to talk to you about, but I want to up level a bit, and we'll go rather quickly because I do want to give some time to ask questions. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We have to consider that as we make this clean energy transition, that we do not leave behind our most vulnerable communities. We often identify those communities as our limited income communities or communities of color, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And there's a lot of intersectionality when we talk about our customers and how they engage with energy and how we can ensure an equitable future. Next slide, please. So we gather data to kind of look at how customers are engaging with energy, and we often focus our efforts on how do we address our communities that are considered limited income. But when we look across demographics, income is only one factor of how folks are engaging with energy. We know that folks of color, people that identify as Black, Hispanic, or Native American are experiencing energy burdens much higher than our white households of the same income. So what is happening within our communities that is causing these types of energy burdens and impacting the way people are engaging with energy? Can we have the next slide, please? And we ask ourselves these questions without really understanding what equity means. So I appreciate that the folks that you just listened to have taken the time to define what equity is in their communities. But as I work with regulators and regulatory bodies across the country, many of them do not actually know what equity means to them and the communities that they serve. How do we measure and improve equity with not understanding what it means? And so one of the recommendations that I make in the work that I do is first to sit down and think about what does equity mean and start collecting data. Next slide, please. So where do we start when we collect data? And we have to start with our communities. We've heard from the different panelists, different strategies and tactical approaches to gathering data from communities. All of those are fantastic, and many of them work really well. And we tend to extract that information from communities without giving back. To have deep and meaningful engagement is not a one-way communication, is two-way. While we're getting information from our communities, we have to ensure that we give back to those communities in a way that's meaningful to them. In this process, we need to acknowledge that the regulatory policy and pragmatic equities are barriers to inclusive and equitable clean energy future. All of us have a role in ensuring that our most vulnerable customers are able to engage with energy and be healthy. Next slide, please. So when I think about energy equity and the things that we often focus on, we think about access to programs, the distribution of dollars and benefits, and representation. And you all have heard really great tactics on how to address some of these different aspects of equity, but we need to make sure we include them in the regulatory process. Many of the folks that are most vulnerable and in most need of our support to ensure that they stay safe and healthy are not the folks that show up in the regulatory process, not because they're agnostic or don't care, it's because they simply don't have the time, and life's burdens do not allow them to make it to a regulatory meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So how do we figure out how to bring those voices into the conversation and develop policy and regulation that meets their needs? not only are talking about our customers, but I'd like you also to consider how the regulatory process impacts vendors, our partners, and even the folks that work in the regulatory system. We have to make sure that we have good representation so that those voices are being heard. Next slide. Just a graphic here for you all to see that for most states around the country, we're only starting to see equity metrics emerging. And even where there's been equity metrics are being identified, they're not being widely implemented. And oftentimes the reason why they're not being implemented is because we have a data gap. It is hard to measure things if you aren't able to collect the data to know if you're moving in the right direction. We especially have challenges collecting racial information, gender, different identity information amongst our populations. We're very good at collecting income information. So that's why we often see a lot of metrics and policies around income levels, income qualified programs, but that's just, as I mentioned earlier, one aspect of equity, and we have to look at the intersectionality of equity metrics. Next slide. So the Energy Equity Project was mentioned earlier. I was a contributing author in this document. This is an excellent start for us to really dive into equity metrics. This is a framework that could help different regulatory bodies develop metrics that are specific for them. As you look at this document, if you all are not aware of it, it provides some initial guidance of different metrics that might work within your communities. It is up to you to take those metrics and customize them and make them relevant for the communities that you serve. Next slide, please. Here an example of the different types of metrics and frameworks that you might want to look at. We talked about procedural equity, we talked about distributive equity, and these tend to be the types of pillars that we focus on, primarily because they're the easiest for us to make change. When we talk about systemic and institutional inequities, those are much harder, much longer term, but ultimately have outcomes that cascade through communities. So while this is where we usually start, I encourage you to not be where we finish. Let's look how we can move institutional and systemic barriers aside so that folks can engage with energy in an equitable way. Next slide, please. Went through that very quickly. As they mentioned, we will have these slides open to you all. So if you have any questions, happy to answer them.
Thank you, Quinn, and thank you to all of our panelists for your very interesting and informative, uplifting presentations today. We have a few minutes left, so we can answer a couple of questions before we wrap up at the top of the hour. I want to lead off, bringing it back to the start to Eric. We had a number of questions in the chat regarding your recommendation on intervenor compensation. In your presentation, you briefly mentioned advisory boards, I believe it was, as a potentially more effective alternative to traditional intervenor funding. Could you come back and elaborate on that? I want to talk about how we could maybe leverage intervenor funding plus other forms of engagement, to better incorporate more stakeholders. I want to start with Eric, and then maybe open that up to the wider panel.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So to be clear, I don't want to dismiss intervenor compensation. I think it's very important, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that there's a broad range of intervenor compensation. It looks very different in different states. A lot of research shows some states are not very effective with intervenor compensation. It's very difficult for communities to get. They have to prove impact. They have to go through a very long process. They have to wait months, if not years, to be reimbursed for those costs. Other states do intervenor compensation really well. Also, intervenor compensation can mean intervention in a specific case, legal intervention, essentially hiring a lawyer, or it can be broader. So some states are starting to talk about participant compensation instead. And this could be getting involved in a working group rather than legally or formally intervening in a docket. And I think that's a really powerful tool. And I believe Michelle mentioned that a little bit in Oregon. And I think intervenor compensation for things like training is really useful as well. In terms of advisory boards, so the two examples that I'm really aware of are the Low Income Oversight Board in California and the Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group. And I think a benefit of those is that these are not one-time interventions in a specific docket. They're much broader. They're actually going out and looking for representatives rather than requiring the community group or intervener to come to the PUC. So it's a bit more active on the PUC side. And I think it's an interesting model in that it's kind of always there providing input and is a bit broader rather than focusing on one specific docket, and often involves community members themselves rather than legal representation. Thanks for those questions.
Mhm. Yeah, of course. And I kind of wanted to open it up to the broader panel. Maybe if somebody has ideas on how we could, leverage traditional intervener funding models with other forms of engagement. Is there anything that any of the rest of you know or are interested or are working on as far as expanding beyond traditional models? I mean, how is it working for you? Michelle, you did mention that Oregon has intervener funding. How is that structured?
So it's $500,000 that is, annually available with carryover. It's collected from the utilities. And I would say that I mentioned this in the presentation, but we've tried to make it non-traditional intervener funding by allowing for an application process that isn't docket specific. And it's also coupled with training opportunities directly with our chief ALJ in order to kind of promote like new parties to engage. And I will say some of the things that we've noticed and heard from stakeholders is this idea that you have your, very frequent flying energy advocate interveners. And while this funding is great, there's a benevolence and empathy there to not want to utilize all of the funding for their purposes, especially in the interest of creating more comprehensive community engagement. And so that's kind of a nut we're still trying to crack, because I think that even with the existence of dedicated intervener funding for EJ advocacy, the commission and the utilities and other stakeholders need to be cognizant of taking the measures to bring those folks to the table. And so kind of offering, the funding and the training isn't enough if it's not coupled with the outreach to let folks know that it's available and, facilitate some of that engagement yourself. I think we've also tried to leverage things like focus groups and more dynamic public meeting sessions in order to kind of, at the very least, create awareness and then create the space to talk about the availability of intervener funding. We've also worked with stakeholders to talk about the value of coalitioning in situations where smaller organizations have limited resources and capacity, even with the funding available. It can be very hard to hire for temporary positions on kind of ambiguous docket assignments. And so I think addressing some of those concerns would be really valuable to any organization interested in pursuing dedicated intervener funding.
Yeah, I think we should, also make space for less formal contributions and information into the litigation process. As Michelle mentioned, focus groups or listening sessions where there's a pathway to get that information and be considered in litigation instead of just contributing information to the process is actually part of the litigation process.
Thank you, Quinn and Michelle. And I would love to continue this discussion, but I'm looking down at the clock and we're just about out of time. So unfortunately, it doesn't look like we have time to take any more questions. I just want to step back and give a wonderful thank you to Eric, Jesse, Michelle, and Quinn for all of your lovely, informative, thorough presentations today. I came away from this with a better understanding of how commissions or your work across the country, how you're incorporating equity-related issues, and you're actively working to incorporate equity into your processes and proceedings, and we're iterating and we're building on all of the great work that's being done right now. I hope as an audience that you come away from this webinar with a better idea of how you could go about trying to incorporate equity into work in your own state. I'll wrap up by reminding us all that this is Part one in a three-part webinar series co-hosted by RAP and NARUC. The next webinars will be on workforce diversity and long-term affordability coming in April and May. So please keep an eye out for those. And I will pass it back to Commissioner Hudson if you want to give a final word. Thank you all.
Thank you, Raphael. Let me just take this time to thank our panelists, thank our audience today. I personally want to thank Regina for putting all this together. And also I want to thank everyone else who really is just really passionate about this issue, and look forward to many more webinars from RAP in the upcoming months, and also just wish you a very great weekend. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.